the chat. There's an online text box, and with the team, we are monitoring that online text box. And for those of you who are in the room, please raise your hand, raise your floor when we arrive at the Q&A session. Now, before we get started, there is a final housekeeping remark for your attention. And it's important to note that this session is being recorded and that we will make the recordings available after the event. Now, with all this housekeeping, having completed that, let me turn to our high-level opening speakers. It's my great honor to welcome and to thank three very distinguished opening speakers. His Excellency Ambassador Simon Manley, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations Office, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. Ms. Olga Algayerova, Executive Secretary at UNECE, and Lord Mark Sedwill, UK Prime Minister's Envoy for Economic Resilience and Chair of the G7 Panel on Economic Resilience. And with this, we will start the substantive part of the session, and I'm delighted to have His Excellency Ambassador Simon Manley here with us in the room. So with that, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for that very warm introduction. It's a real honour to be on this platform with you and Executive Secretary and the Executive Director, Olga and Natalie. You very kindly kind of referred back to Glasgow. And I think that is kind of our starting point. And let me just say in front of everybody how very grateful we are to the collaboration and support that we enjoyed from so many of the organisations here, and personified by Natalie and Olga, and the support we got from both IISD and UNECE in Glasgow. And I think, as we all know, Glasgow has offered us a possibility. It has offered us a possibility of staying within 1.5 degree climate change. It's offered us a way forward with the kind of the vision that we set out in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But that will mean nothing unless we are able to implement that pact, to pursue the promises that we have made, actually see these commitments taken forward. And I think as we meet here today, this is part of that effort. It's about looking in particular about how those of us based here in Geneva can work together to deliver that ambition set out in Glasgow by our leaders. And, the subject that we're discussing today is really fundamental to that, I think, as we all know. So back in Glasgow, we, I think, saw, now we calculate about 90% of the world economy is now covered by a net zero goal. And kind of within that, we now have a 190 strong coalition of governments, financial institutions, and utility companies who are committed to phase out, I use those verbs carefully, phase out coal power and move to clean energy. 33 countries, as you know, signed the Zero Emission Vehicle Declaration for accelerating electric mobility markets. But underpinning those commitments is, of course, the challenge that we're looking at today. The need for a resilient, sustainable, and ethical supply of critical minerals. And you are going to have far more expert voices talking about this over the course of the next couple of hours. So I feel sort of slightly intrepid in sort of setting some of these stuff out. But we all know how important technology, critical minerals and metals are to that effort, to their importance, whether it be in electric vehicle batteries, offshore wind turbines, or other green technologies. I think we've all heard the statistics about how, for example, an electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car, and how an onshore wind plant requires 9 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired plant. But we've just got to do it, and therefore we have to address these issues. We all know how, if we're to meet these targets, there is going to just be the most extraordinary shift towards clean energy systems over the next few years, and therefore the most extraordinary demand for these minerals. I mean, we've seen just over the last 10 years in the UK, us kind of move from a standing start to become the world's, I'd say, the world's leader in offshore energy. It's been an extraordinary transformation and one that's kind of revolutionising energy supply in the UK, but it is dependent upon these critical minerals. And you'll know that in the UK, with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said a kind of a 10-point plan, as we put it, for a kind of what we speak of as a green industrial revolution. And I think it is a revolution in the way that we are going to be running our economies, running our societies, if we are to achieve net zero. Within that plan, we speak of quadrupling offshore wind capacity by 2030. And that's quite some commitment when you consider the scale of the transformation we've seen already. We've also announced £500 million to support electrification of vehicles and their supply chains. All part of that broader net zero strategy. We've said ourselves kind of nationally that we're going to be publishing our own UK critical mineral strategy early next year, and we have an independent expert committee on critical minerals, which is engaging in stakeholder consultations. We're investing in research, we're investing in analysis, and most important of all for this afternoon's discussion, we really want to work with international partners and organisations, including UNECE, including WSD, including ISO, to promote global standards that support a more sustainable, resilient and ethical supply chain, and where we can to move towards a kind of more circular economy, to use a phrase beloved of the lady to my left, for these minerals. And that's one of the reasons why we've secured funding for a research project hosted by the British Geological Survey to contribute to the development of UNECE standards in this area. And Paul Lusky, I think, is going to speak about that later. So as we build on the Glasgow Climate Pact and put it into effect, as we hope speed up the adoption of green technologies across our societies that we believe can not only help us achieve that net zero target, but actually do so in a way that is sustainable and just, and that actually is a net positive for our societies. We need to work together internationally as governments, as international organisations, and as businesses to ensure that we have these more resilient critical mineral supply chains. We need to do so in a way that is not just consistent with, but actually upholds and promotes the highest labour and environmental standards to ensure that this transition, this green industrial revolution, benefits people not just in the UK or in Switzerland, but in those countries in which those resources are being extracted. And I hope that as we gather here today and we listen and learn from each other, that we can think about how we can develop those strategies successfully, and to enable us to take the decisive action that we need to take on the back of the Glasgow Climate Pact to ensure that we can genuinely, credibly stay within 1.5 degrees and ensure a greener, more sustainable future for our people. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Ambassador, for these opening remarks. And you've already contextualized the debate and basically brought us very much into the substance. And so many thanks also for this and for being with us here today. I'd like to now go to our second distinguished opening speaker, and it's my great pleasure to invite UNECE Executive Secretary, Ms. Olga Algayerova, to give her opening address. And thank you for being with us. Olga, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Elizabeth, and Your Excellency, Ambassador Manley. Great opening. Thank you. Lord Sedwill, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Warmly welcome to our event on future-proofing supply of critical minerals for net zero. I am very pleased to see our excellent cooperation with the United Kingdom continuing and flourishing. So together we thought of holding today's event as a follow-up to COP26 in Glasgow to reconvene audiences from Geneva and beyond, bring back the many complex topics discussed in Glasgow, share with different organizations and see what they are doing and their climate action tools that we have available and in place, and discuss how we can even more enhance our collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, COP26 underlined the existential need to address climate change. For this, we must optimize our endowments of natural resources without hindering quality of life and the aspirations for quality of life around the world. These ambitions require integrated solutions that deliver on the environmental, economic and social dimensions. Governments and international organizations, including the UN regional commissions, must play their role by cooperating and sharing the best practices. We have renewable or green alternatives that can allow us to meet our climate and sustainable development goals. As His Excellency Ambassador noted, however, the challenge lies in the fast-growing demand for mineral inputs to build those alternatives. To meet it, we need to move towards, and you know my favorite circular economy concept, through pragmatic policies. UNECE has embarked on a new big nexus vision for sustainable management of resources, which emphasizes integrated solutions leading to zero harm, zero waste, and a circular economy. This, our vision, rests on a 5-point agenda, which is also included in the UN Secretary General's policy brief on transforming the extractive industries for sustainable development. A social contract on natural resources, a sustainable financing taxonomy, sustainable resource management using our concepts of UNFC, what is the framework classification for resources, and UNRMS, what is the resource management system. Then next is the transparency, traceability of the minerals value chain, and finally, comprehensive strategic environmental assessment. So you are probably familiar with the UN framework classification for resources developed by UNECE. This framework is a tool for classifying and reporting natural resources. The UN resource management system under development provides a set of standards for integrated and sustainable management of resources, of course aligned with the 2030 agenda. So these tools help address the 5-point agenda and the issue of materials. For example, the United Kingdom and other countries have successfully tested the application of the UN framework classification for resources to integrate information on critical raw materials, including battery raw materials. And I would like to thank at this place to the United Kingdom and the British Geological Survey for their support of our framework classification and management system. I hope this cooperation can extend to other areas of mutual interest. The 5-point agenda mentions value chains as another key factor. Indeed, the complexity and opaqueness of critical materials value chains make it very, very hard to know exactly where environmental and socio-economic impacts occur. To manage value chain more sustainably and to transition to a low-carbon or more circular economy, both consumers and businesses must first be aware of the nature and magnitude of these risks and have the tools to measure, mitigate, and prevent them. Improving the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, as we know it, traceability and transparency of value chains is therefore the priority. To address this, UNECE has established a new team of specialists to improve ESG traceability and transparency of value chains and promote a circular transition in key industries such as critical minerals, agri-food, fishery, garment, footwear, transport, and waste management. Their work will build on our project that is called Enhancing Transparency and Traceability of Sustainable Value Chains in Garment and Footwear, where we developed a series of policy recommendations, implementation guidelines, and standards. Together, these provide practical solutions for tracking the sustainability performance of any garment or footwear from raw component to the point of purchase. The final item of this 5-point agenda is comprehensive strategic environmental assessments. And this is very relevant to critical materials as well. For the mines of the future to perform better, responsibility to the planet should be the ultimate principle. We need to strengthen the one-off project-by-project environmental impact assessment with an additional layer of strategic environmental assessments. Then we have a systematic process for evaluating the environmental implications of a proposed policy, plan, or program. This can help to address issues at the earliest stage of decision-making. And UNECE has done such an assessment in several countries in our region and could support ones for the mining sector too. So, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude here by wishing you a successful session and deliberations. We all have developed valuable tools to support our objectives on this topic. We should learn from each other and strengthen partnerships among international organizations, not only in Geneva, but also beyond. I look forward to continue this fruitful cooperation between UNECE, the United Kingdom, and all partner organizations represented here today and that contributed to this excellent event. So let me also assure you that this is not an ad hoc event. We already plan to reconvene to take stock of progress in April next year during the UNECE Resource Management Week. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Executive Secretary, and many thanks, Olga, for also highlighting so clearly the UNECE contribution on the side of energy, trade, and also environment. With this, I'm turning to our third high-level opening speaker. And here it's important to remember that earlier this year, the G7 summit in Cornwall, it focused its decisions on and its discussions on building back better from the pandemic and building forward better. Building forward to ensure that the global economic system is in the right space to meet environmental challenges of the 21st century. And under the UK presidency of the G7, the former UK Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, Lord Sedwill, he chaired a panel on economic resilience. Now, as the Prime Minister's envoy for economic resilience, he and his ministers set out recommendations to build economic resilience across critical minerals. Unfortunately, Lord Sedwill could not join us here today, but he has provided us with a pre-recorded statement, so I would ask the tech team now to display the video.
Thank you to the UN Economic Commission for Europe for inviting me to speak on the impact of sustainable resource management and trade for the Net Zero and G7 Economic Resilience Agenda. I'm really sorry I'm unable to be with you in person today. While the G7 panel I chaired took a strategic approach to global economic resilience, focusing on how to blend sound economic policies at the national level with reforms to global economic governance, one of the areas on which we focused was critical raw materials. Along with semiconductors and digital data, these represent the oil, steel, and electricity of the 21st century economy. They are vital to the green transition, but there are substantial challenges. We're seeing a concentration of market power in all three sectors, and monopolies, whether they arise for good or bad reasons, the natural selection of the market or state intervention or both, monopolies create inevitable vulnerabilities in supply chains. The issue is particularly acute in the supply of critical minerals, which relies on the extractive industries, often based in politically vulnerable parts of the world, and refining, which has become over-concentrated in China, because they've invested heavily in it over the past decade or more. But aside from those structural issues, there's a basic supply issue. Rising demand means intensified mining. Responsible, clean and smart mining is clearly part of the answer, but we must also extract as much value for as long as possible from those resources that have already been mined. Recycling rates are low. Generating a genuinely circular economy requires international standards and international cooperation. The UK has made a voluntary national commitment to promote the sustainable management of critical raw materials and unlock opportunities for circular supply chains. This includes investing in research, piloting approaches to supply chain traceability through new technologies, and working on the development of global standards. My panel's key recommendation was the Cornwall Consensus to address the gaps in global economic governance, recognising that the market-based approach of the Washington Consensus is necessary but not sufficient for the challenges of the mid-21st century. Our report recommends that the G7 and partners cooperate more effectively on securing the reliable supply of these critical materials, and that they should develop contingency plans to cope with disruption to supply chains, whether from socio-economic, environmental or geopolitical shocks. We also recommend mapping stocks and flows of key goods, such as critical minerals and semiconductors, and ensuring with allies the financing of research and development into rare earth elements. Moreover, we also suggest that the G7 should campaign to improve environmental, social and governance standards within these critical sectors and use those standards to promote the circular economy worldwide. I hope that among those of you joining today's sessions, many will want to stand beside us in taking steps to promote the sustainable, resilient management of critical materials and thus provide part of the platform to build forward better as we reform the global economic system to meet the needs of our people and the planet in the mid-21st century. I wish you well in your endeavours. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you.
Wonderful. With that, I'd like to thank our opening speakers for these very insightful remarks. In fact, we've already gone fully into the substance, and our speakers, they have been setting the context for what promises to be a really interesting debate. They've linked it to the key agendas and the work streams out there, be it COP26, be it UNECE and circular economy. And clearly we can see the topic is relevant, timely, and also complex. Let us now turn to the panel. Again, we have a hybrid panel with some speakers in the room and some speakers online. And in fact, we are joined by a wonderful panel who really presents the very different facets of the critical minerals agenda. They will look at critical minerals all along the supply chain, from mine to market. And when looking at the critical mineral supply chain, they will look at the trade dimension, and they will also look at the investment dimension of these supply chains. They will take very different angles to critical mineral supply chains, talking about efficiency, resilience, and surely sustainability, notably the environmental and social aspects of the critical mineral supply chain. And they will look at the role of standards, setting standards, implementing standards, and also tracking and tracing implementation of these standards along different value chains and supply chains. Having harmonized data on critical material, whether primary or secondary, is also a key issue they will look at. And in that regard, they will share with us different tools and work streams, including work streams that UNECE is engaged with on this important topic. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome the panel. And we have with us on the screen Mr. Rohitesh Dhawan, Chief Executive Officer from the International Council on Mining and Metal, ICMM. We have with us in the room here Ms. Natalie Bernasconi, Executive Director, International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD Europe. We have with us online Mr. Paul Lusty, Head of Critical Materials at the British Geological Survey. Also very pleased to have with us online Mr. Aiko Lim, Director of Trade and Environment at the World Trade Organization. And last but not least, Ms. Karen Batt, Head of International at Standards Australia and convener of the ISO Strategic Advisory Group on Critical Minerals. So thank you to all our speakers for joining us and for being with us, and including particularly when this is difficult in terms of timing. Now, let us turn to our first speaker. And when we look at the different interdependent steps at the value chain, extracting materials is sort of like one of the first key steps. And to provide us with insights on the process and also at the responsibility and sustainable practices needed in the industry, I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker who is attending virtually. That's Mr. Rohitesh Dhawan, CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals. ICMM brings together nearly 30 mining and metals companies and over 35 national, regional and commodities association members. And ICMM works to strengthen the social and environmental performance in the mining and metals industry. Their mining principles, they serve as best practice framework on sustainable development in the mining and metals industry. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome CEO of ICMM. Before being appointed as CEO, Mr. Dhawan's career has also been at the intersection of sustainability, resources, and geopolitics. So happy to have you. And Ro, over to you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I thought I would share with you the perspective of the companies that make up the ICMM, which you just noted account for about a third of the global industry across 650 sites in over 50 countries. And we all gather at the ICMM to find ways in which we can raise the performance and contribution of the mining and metals industry to the most important sustainable development issues. And so, Elizabeth, when looking at this issue of critical minerals, I'd like to suggest a perspective from us that changes the meaning of the word critical just a little bit. Because when we first think about critical minerals, we think of them as critical for the technologies of the future, which is entirely correct. Because as we've already heard, without these metals and minerals, a net zero economy is not possible because they are all built on the back of these metals and minerals. But they're critical for a different reason too, which is that they can be powerful sources of social and economic development in countries where these minerals are extracted and processed. But the only way they will be this powerful force of positive development is if they are produced with the highest possible standards of responsibility. And we know the evidence of this because in some work that the ICMM has done, we found that in the last 25 years, countries that are mining dependent, which means that they get a substantial portion of their revenues or export earnings from the mining and metals sector, have managed to develop on a range of sustainable development indicators faster than countries that are not endowed with these metals and minerals. And it gets even more interesting because within that group of countries that are mining dependent, those that have sound governance, and that includes, of course, the public sector, but the private sector's actions too, those countries have outperformed countries where the levels of governance are less strong. Now, Elizabeth, the reason this matters is because, as we've heard from our high-level speakers earlier, the amount of mining that we will need as a world is going to increase. And so if we keep at the heart of this increased production a set of covenants and principles that guide us to make sure that not only are we producing the metals and minerals that will ultimately power a net zero economy, but we're doing it in the most responsible way that minimizes harm, maximizes benefit, then actually we've achieved the outcome from these minerals, not just in their use, but also in their production. And as we'll hear later, Elizabeth, there are other speakers on the panel who will cover this aspect of how we can make sure that minerals are produced in the most responsible fashion. We as the industry have voluntarily for the last 19 years abided by a set of principles, and there are 10 in total, and they contain a set of very detailed expectations, not just of the ICMM companies that have a commitment to abide by them, but indeed the wider industry, to adopt them as the way that we can all ensure that our production contributes, not just in the end use of the product, but certainly in the way that they are produced too. But the mining principles that we have at ICMM rely on and work closely with other standards like those of the OECD, but they are by no means the only option for others who are committed like us to maximize the responsibility with which these metals are produced, because there are other very, very good standards out there. But the point I really want to make, and this is what I will end on here, Elizabeth, is that while we are absolutely right to keep our eye on the fact that we need substantially greater amounts of these metals and minerals, just take copper, for instance. The amount of copper we will need between now and 2030 will mean that we need to essentially bring into production the equivalent of the world's largest copper mine that we have today every year for the next 20 years. That just really gives you a sense of the scale at which the production of these metals is set to grow. That as we keep an eye on that, we certainly do not lose sight of the fact that how these metals are produced is as important, if not more important, than how they are used. And to that end, we're certainly pleased to be able to offer our principles to others as a standard and a framework they may adopt. But I certainly look forward to others who have a similar sense of where we might go as an industry and as a collective across stakeholders to adopt the highest possible standards of responsible performance. So, Elizabeth, I'll leave it there.
Many thanks, Ro, and very interesting in terms of remembering the powerful force of development that critical minerals and minings can be if they are produced in an environmentally and socially just way. And as you mentioned, the importance of sound governance frameworks and also solid regulatory frameworks. And great to also hear you speak about the 10 principles by ICMM. Now, with these questions, we are already right in the substance of our next speaker. As companies trade and invest in this important sector, they do face many challenges, and they are also turning to technological innovation and data to reduce the risk and to track the risk across their supply chains and to track their environmental and social footprint. So ensuring transparency and traceability of supply chains is an important aspect in this regard. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome here at the podium Ms. Natalie Bernasconi, who is currently also serving as the Vice Chair of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, our team of specialists on environmental, social and governance traceability of sustainable value chains in the circular economy. Now, Natalie is heading IISD Europe. She's the Executive Director of IISD Europe, and in that regard also oversees the role of IISD as the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals and Sustainable Development, the IGF. Now, with that, Natalie, happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me here today. And of course, coming out of COP26, we all know really what we already knew going in, and that is that we cannot support a global economy producing net zero carbon emissions without a skyrocketing need for various metals and minerals. And so this rise in demand for critical minerals raises many technical, many policy and sustainability challenges. As we heard from Ro, it can open new opportunities for source countries, but it can also spur huge concerns about sustainable extraction and sourcing. This is particularly important since research shows that the majority of current production volumes of critical minerals come from regions with low governance scores or high emission intensity. In a study on green conflict minerals that my organization IISD conducted, we mapped mineral reserves to measures of fragility and corruption to identify possible future conflict hotspots. On rare earths, for example, we found 58% of reserves were located in states listed either as fragile or very fragile, and 94% of reserves were in states perceived to be corrupt or very corrupt. So it is clear, in the rush to finding solutions to combat the climate crisis, we also need to be extremely mindful to ensure the responsible and sustainable extraction and trade of the minerals needed for the energy transition. This means that we need to take into account greenhouse gas emissions from the critical mineral development. We need to take into account local pollution and local water use. And on the social side, we have to ensure worker safety and welfare and human rights. And finally, we need to address the danger of corruption and conflict financing. As we heard, we have tools to help us operationalize these goals. Most prominently, I think, are the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals, but we also heard from the ICMM principles. We also have some operational due diligence frameworks in which traceability is a criterion. For example, the London Metal Exchange will soon require copper, cobalt, and tin producers sourcing from the DRC to perform third-party audits. It is also interesting to look at the LBMA, which is the London Global Authority for the Precious Metal Market. And this LBMA is currently looking at a global solution to mitigate potential threats to the integrity of the global precious metals market by increasing transparency and increasing traceability. The solution they are looking at is in two parts. They are looking at new technology to securely record bar-specific data, such as brand, origin, location, and so forth. And they are also looking into technology to help ensure that any bar can be registered and subsequently be reliably and uniquely identified. These are really important developments, even if they are not yet uniquely focused on critical minerals. Traceability systems are key for making responsible mining a reality. They allow business partners to trace back input purchased and processed, and they allow to track final products through the supply chain. Traceability systems are often referred to as digital highways that move data and connect organizations and people. Now, just to finish, technology such as blockchain, of course, plays a critical role here, and we can learn from other sectors, such as garments, for instance, how to best collect product-associated data and share it across value chain actors. And the UNECE's expertise both on energy on the one hand and value chains and trade on the other can play a very important role in helping make the net zero transition a reality, but also to help ensure that there is zero harm to people and planet as well. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Natalie, for sharing with us some of the very relevant work that IISD is carrying out also on the research side and the data side, and for pointing us to these new technological solutions that are out there that could be powerful solutions. Maybe they are not yet applied in the critical mineral sector, but that's something to think about, and that's also one of the areas of work we are engaging in at UNECE. Now, in our next segment, we really look at standards and see how standards can help ensure that the extraction and the management of critical materials happens in a sustainable way. And these standards are tools, and they are relevant for getting more value out of the minerals already in circulation. And so that can also really help us for the circular economy agenda. And finally, we'll also be hearing more about what is happening in the UK. And for that, I turn to our next speaker, who will be joining us online, Mr. Paul Lusty, who will provide insights into available solutions, tools and standards for resilient and sustainable supply. Paul is head of critical minerals at the British Geological Survey, and BGS is really like a world-leading provider of objective and authoritative geoscientific data, information and knowledge. Paul is a chartered geologist, and he has worked extensively also in the developing world. Now, with that, I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Lusty from the British Geological Survey, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So we've already heard a lot of very useful context about why we need more efficient and effective tools for optimizing resource management and their efficient handling. So from a conceptual perspective, classifying resources as critical raw materials is no different to any other commodity group, as basically their intrinsic geological properties and the mineral deposits they occur in are not particularly unique. Their criticality is primarily a function of non-geological factors that affect their supply risk. So these are factors such as production concentration, social and environmental issues, which we've already discussed, the geopolitical risks in the supply chain. So these three criteria that the UN framework classification uses to characterize resources are just as relevant to critical raw materials as other resource types. As the Executive Secretary mentioned earlier, the British Geological Survey has already tried to apply UNFC to harmonise data on mineral resources and reserves in the UK to good effect. BGS has also undertaken work on cobalt resources in Europe, and this demonstrates how UNFC can be applied to improve classification of critical raw material deposits, communicate resource estimates and uncertainty, importantly, associated with those, and facilitate reliable comparisons of national, regional, and global resource inventories. But it's important to point out that this case study also highlights some issues that we all need to address and tackle. These are associated with data quality, general data availability, the resolution of the data to undertake the analysis, and issues with harmonisation, principally owing to the byproduct nature of many critical metals. More reliable estimates of critical mineral resources requires consistent reporting of data on these important potential byproduct metals. This would also fundamentally support the basic principle that the development footprint for mineral development should be minimised by recovering maximum value from a deposit when it is developed. So thinking about the developing UN resource management system, this is being designed as a complementary extension to UNFC. Importantly, it will take a more holistic view of resource management to support strategic decision-making that also incorporates circular economy principles wherever possible. Metals, importantly, are ideal flows for a circular economy, as with careful stewardship and appropriate technology, many metals mined from the earth can be reused indefinitely, helping to reduce demand for primary raw materials and also contributing to security of supply by diversifying supply sources. The update of UNFC to include anthropogenic resources facilitates this vision, and it also helps with the application of UNFC and its associated tools to the circular economy. But extracting maximum value from secondary raw materials requires improved mapping and monitoring of the physical economy of metals and understanding how they interact with primary resources. This requires a systems approach based on stocks and flows models that integrate information on economic value, environmental performance, and social impacts throughout the value chain. This will improve our understanding of this vital time dimension, so when supplies are needed relative to when stocks will become available for reuse versus through end-of-use recycling. This will also help to ensure this type of modelling, that these interactions between the economy and environment are properly accounted for, and the optimum stages for technical and policy interventions are identified. The key challenge, particularly in the case of critical raw materials, is our nascent understanding of the system. Data availability, as I mentioned earlier, and a lack of interoperability between raw materials data sets arising from different countries, international systems, and between primary and secondary raw materials. It's also very important to recognise that even if we can reliably quantify stocks of secondary raw materials in use, their ultimate levels of recoverability remains unclear due to a host of economic and technical factors. Met for Tech, which is one of the 5 new circular economy centres that has been established in the UK, is investigating these challenges. It will explore how to create a circular economy for technology metals, including developing a national virtual data observatory. As the ambassador indicated, the UK is taking a leading role in regulatory diplomacy for raw materials. It has recently funded a BGS project on developing guidelines and best practices for the recording of resources to support the sustainable development of technology critical minerals. This study will also support the global implementation of UNFC and UNRMS guidelines, and also provide initial scoping for an international centre of excellence on sustainable resource management. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present on this very important topic, and I will finish there.
Many thanks, Paul, for sharing some of the very important work that BGS is doing and how you're also applying the UNFC. And you've also flagged for us the importance of having a better understanding on the availability of these raw materials, both primary and secondary materials, and the many questions that arise when we try to harness this really for a circular economy transition. Now, as many speakers have already mentioned before, as the demand for the clean technologies is growing, that also implies a growing demand for critical raw materials. And global access to these materials is a growing concern also for countries with market implications around all of this. Now, to give us some insights about the trade and market dynamics of critical raw materials and how international institutions are working to face up to modern-day economic challenges at the interface of trade and climate change, for that we are joined by Mr. Aiko Lim. Mr. Ho Lim is the director of the Trade and Environment Division at the World Trade Organization, WTO. And these days in Geneva and beyond, we are all looking at the WTO as the organization is preparing for its 12th ministerial conference. Now, Ho Lim is responsible in the organization for the work on environmental-related matters, as well as the agreement on technical barriers to trade and its committee. Many thanks, Mr. Lim, for taking the time to join us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you. I think a lot of things that I was going to say has already, in fact, been said by many of the other speakers, but mainly just to recall a little bit, as was said really right from the beginning, COP26 has made it very clear that, we need to move towards low carbon emission energy systems. And to do so, we need to be implementing and accelerating much quicker low carbon technologies. So this means essentially, as has been pointed out, a transformation in the way we produce and consume energy, and with that, a critical reliance on certain minerals. And as many of you know, the work on this is certainly ongoing by many different organizations. A recent study by the World Bank, for instance, points to the fact that production of certain minerals, such as graphite, lithium, cobalt, must increase by around 500% by 2050 if we're going to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. This means also that some 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy wind, solar, geothermal power, as well as energy storage. And as you have pointed towards, this will have a profound impact on the international trade landscape. As all of us know, natural endowments in some key rare earths and raw materials vary broadly across regions. And this is maybe stating really just the obvious, that, you know, just as trade in oil, coal, and gas in many senses profoundly impacted and defined international trade in the 20th century and global energy security, I think as we look at the world going forward in the 21st century and the need for low carbon energy generation, that the same questions and issues are certainly there and will be even more profound as we go forward. Now, you know, when it comes to international trade and international trade policy, a necessary part of the solution will be about trade facilitative measures, avoiding of frictions, addressing market constraints to ramping up production and then trade in goods, in particular in these essential goods or minerals. And I think we also need to better understand and help to break, if I can say, the boom and bust cycles that have so often affected the mineral sector. And we can do so by looking at addressing market failures, looking at distortive price signals, such as inefficient subsidies, at climate unfriendly tariffs and taxes, and dealing with red tape. Now, if we can provide much greater stability and predictability, this will help market operators as they galvanize huge investment flows needed for this clean energy transition. And this is probably one area where WTO and other organizations can make a big contribution, which is to look at global value chains, how to make them more resilient and more able to adapt to, I would say, two types of shocks. One are policy shocks, which are essentially measures that governments may take. And another are actually even climate shocks themselves. And this could even be about climate impacts and how this would impact our own value chains. And here at WTO, you know, we have in the recent past, of course, in the recent I would say, a lot of work has gone into COVID-19 related value chains, particularly in terms of vaccines required to combat COVID-19. Now, some of these dynamics and lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19 situation, not of course immediately translatable to the type of issues we're looking at today, but I think they provide some insights to better understanding market barriers, better understanding where are the supply chain bottlenecks, and what type of policies and policy measures that greater cooperation needs to be built on. One measure, for instance, would be such as export restrictions. What type of cooperation could there be between governments to avoid the use of export restrictions, for instance? We would also need to reflect on how trade and trade policy can help ramp up, in some cases, production of critical materials, whilst, of course, you know, recognizing the need to ensure what has already been said on standards, on traceability, on environmental and social sustainability. And another aspect to all of this, of course, when we talk about climate and climate action, the need for a just transition to take into account specific needs of developing countries, small and medium-sized enterprises, to ensure that this doesn't just become a situation where one finds solutions for, let's say, a club of larger producers to the disadvantage of smaller producers. Now, very quickly, since you mentioned a bit about WTO and MC12, before I get to that, just to say that, you know, we have an environmental database, and through our environmental database, we do find that WTO members have notified some 200 over environment trade related measures in the mining sector. And some of these measures do relate to the issues that you're talking about in relation to critical materials. The way I think to go forward on cooperation is, as usual, to have more transparency, to have more dialogue. We at the WTO, we have the Committee on Trade and Environment, but we also have other dedicated committees which look at specific trade issues and trade concerns in relation, not necessarily on this sector alone, but horizontally across all sectors. And at the ministerial conference, which will be happening in just a few days, it will be a very historic ministerial conference from the perspective of trade and environment, because at this ministerial conference, we will have coalitions of members launching 3 different ministerial statements on environmental sustainability. And this will cover fossil fuel subsidy reform, it will cover plastics pollution, environmental goods and services, sustainable supply chains, as well as circular economy. And, you know, it is, I think, a good sign to show that there is certainly strong interest on members at the WTO on trade and environment, as well as, you know, the reality that we need to quickly address and reverse the triple crisis of pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change. So we are hopeful that we will have a good ministerial conference, and one especially in this area where we can get some clearer guidance from trade ministers on how they see trade as being a crucial part of the solution to many of the challenges that we have in addressing climate mitigation and adaptation. So that's a very general intro to the questions. I hope it's been a little bit helpful, and happy to join in the discussion afterwards. Thank you, Lizzie.
Many thanks, Ho, for bringing the trade perspective to our debate here and raising many important trade-related questions, such as the importance of facilitating trade, of alleviating market constraints, avoiding barriers to trade, and also maybe looking at the very difficult question of export restrictions. And how you've also flagged the importance of predictability and stability, which are sort of like core functions of WTO, and how this can be helpful for the market operators. And we'll surely be interested and curious to hear more about what the ministerial conference will deliver also on the many trade and environment questions that are up for discussions right now. So many thanks to Ho Lim, and as we are looking at the chat, we can see that questions are trickling in, and there is also already like a question about standards and standardization, and that brings us to our next speaker on the list. Now, last in timing and sequencing, but in no way last of in importance, is our next speaker, namely Ms. Karen Batt. And Karen is the head of international at Standards Australia, and also the convener of the ISO Strategic Advisory Group on critical minerals. And as we've heard before, like setting standards is becoming increasingly important for securing critical raw materials and technologies, and also really about ensuring the environmental and social sustainability performance of all the economic processes that are involved in this regard. So Ms. Karen Batt will speak to us about standardization for critical minerals extraction, and also the new ISO Strategic Advisory Group on critical materials. And with this, Karen, the floor is yours. Special thanks to you for joining us at what is maybe not a very easy timing for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning from where I am. It is dark outside, but I'm very pleased to present and be on the panel today. I'm sure many of you would have heard of the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. It's a well-established and trusted developer of technical requirements for products and services by industry, government, and other stakeholders. And it's in fact been developing standards on critical minerals for many decades. The ISO process is one that has stood the test of time. It allows countries to come together to develop standards on a one country, one vote basis. These standards are developed by experts in their fields using consensus and taking account of the views of all the affected parties, which includes government, industry, research, consumers, and so on. So recognizing the ever-increasing importance of critical minerals in the supply chain, in particular for emerging technologies, ISO members earlier this year supported the establishment of a strategic advisory group to examine the current landscape of standards that support critical minerals from the extraction phase to the precursor material stage. But from our discussions, it's also clear that circular economy needs to be considered, as critical minerals will re-enter the value chain and in turn require processing and become precursor materials again. The Strategic Advisory Group is tasked with identifying gaps in the current landscape, and then we will recommend priority areas for work by ISO technical committees and also the structure in which this work will take place. What I also wanted to emphasise was that collaboration is key with other international organisations as part of this effort. And one of the key groups to success is the partnership that we have with the International Electrotechnical Commission. They in turn develop standards setting requirements for batteries and other energy transition technologies, and so their input into the process will be very important as well. I'm really excited about joining the discussion. I know they're short remarks, but very keen to get into that discussion, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Many thanks, Karen, and good morning to Australia from our side. Now, with this, I'd like to thank all our panelists for the first round of interventions. And we've really covered a lot of ground here along the whole critical mineral supply chain. And I can see that we are zooming and focusing in on the ESG dimension of it all. And it's now the time to open up to questions. Some questions are already trickling in the chat and through other tools. And I'm looking also at the room to see if any delegation in the room would wish to raise a question or make a point, and we'll be monitoring all these different avenues of how you can get engaged in the debate. Now, before I play the floor back to our speakers with some sort of like targeted follow-up questions, let me mention one that came through the chat, and I think that is maybe very much a cross-cutting question, and so I'd like to flag it before we turn to the individual speakers again. And it's very interesting that we had a comment from an organization, Women in Mining in Nigeria. And it's being pointed out that women are also an important aspect in the supply chain of critical minerals, and they are frequently particularly vulnerable. So they lack access of technology and also therefore are maybe more vulnerable in terms of pollution and how to find sort of the right tools to protect them. So in case any of the speakers has also some remarks to make on the gender dimension of this important supply chain, please do so. But let us then maybe turn back to our individual panelists. And Ro, you've been the first one to speak, so maybe let me start with you again and bring you back in here in terms of asking you whether there is maybe one key trend in this extractive sector, maybe one of the many trends that you think will be really decisive for the energy transition. So could that be resource taxation or heightened social pressure, or could that be new technologies? So what's your take on the one key trend that will influence the way forward? The floor is back to you, Ro.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I may take the opportunity to give you a quick reaction to that great question about the role of women, and just offer two perspectives. One, to say that as an industry, we have a very long way to go. And I say that because in 2013, women made up only about 10% of the mining workforce. And 7 years later, in 2020, that number is only up to 15%. We all really need to look very hard at that and recognize that as an industry, we really have a very long way to go. But the question also appealed to the fact about the impact of women in communities. And there, of course, it is particularly stark to understand the impacts of COVID-19. I mean, just as we think about some of the numbers looking back, COVID-19 did result in somewhere around 155 million full-time jobs being lost. And that was particularly hard hit on women. And we know that, of course, that when COVID led to a rise in poverty, in extreme poverty for the first time since 1998, women and children were disproportionately affected. So as we think through the critical minerals and how we're going to build a sustainable, just and resilient supply chain for these minerals, we must keep these factors front of mind. Now onto the question you asked me about the one key trend around critical minerals and the energy transition. I would say it would be transparency. Now, why do I say transparency? I say it because over the many years, we have achieved hard-won impacts with the level of transparency, both from companies as well as from governments, on how the results of extractives are being shared amongst populations. And the most prominent measure in this would be the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, where several countries have signed up to be more open about the way that the fortunes of mining and oil and gas activity are being shared. I think as we are seeing the birth, or at least the massive expansion of this industry, it becomes really critical that we keep transparency, openness, and disclosure at the very heart of how we set up these new industries. Because what we want to make sure is that the returns of this critical mineral extraction and use are, of course, shared amongst the communities and countries in which they're extracted and processed. And so let's not think that our job is done as we have promoted transparency in the economy of the past. Let's make sure we do it.
So I fear we are losing Ro a little bit here, but I guess we got the essence of the remarks, and special thanks to Ro for already addressing the two questions, the gender question we got through the chat, and also looking a little bit at what is the one key trend, and very exciting that Ro here zoomed into transparency. There are many different aspects of transparency, but surely that's an important topic, and also key for UNECE and our newly established team of specialists on value chain traceability. So thank you, many thanks, Ro, and we'll come back to you maybe at one point further. Now, let me turn to our second speaker, and our second speaker here in the room, so I hope we don't lose Natalie now. But Natalie, we've been talking quite a bit already about trade and also investment, and maybe you can zoom into a little bit more on the investment landscape and really sort of like talk about what's happening when private and also public money is flowing into this important sector. And maybe when you look at that also, again, surely from IISD, please do take the ESG dimension to it. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I just wanted to promote a tool that the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining has developed and is ongoing. We have a big project on gender and mining. And so the question that was posed, I think a lot of the answers he could find online. So it's on igf.org. You could find some of the resources, because we do think it's a very, very important topic. And so we have both legal tools, but also training online tools that specifically on mining and gender. And it has elements on new technologies in the mining sector, which will likely also include elements for the clean energy transition. And on investment, Elizabeth, I think first I just want to say that, investment, we need to invest also in, as we heard, in recycling and to extract and reuse green minerals. And we need, of course, also investment in sustainable mineral extraction. And the main thing is, I believe, that governments provide clear signals to the market. I think that is the first necessity. And I think that the International Energy Agency, when they produced their first report on critical minerals earlier this year, but before Glasgow, I want to just read an excerpt there where the report reads, "Demand trajectories are subject to large technology and policy uncertainties." Okay, then it goes on later. "The largest source of demand variance comes from uncertainty around the stringency of climate policies. The big question for suppliers is whether the world is really heading for a scenario consistent with the Paris Agreement. Policymakers have a crucial role in narrowing this uncertainty by making clear their ambitions and turning targets into actions. So this is what the IEA said earlier before Glasgow. And I do think that Glasgow has further solidified some of the signaling of policymakers. But it also, of course, showed the tensions, particularly between developed and developing countries in this area. But let me just name 3 signals coming out of Glasgow. First of all, we already heard we have new and more ambitious net zero targets and timelines. So that is very important for the market, right? But we also have in the final COP decision, for the first time, a mentioning of coal and fossil fuels. This has never happened before. And the reference could have been clearer. Some of us know and that were involved because now the language is to accelerate efforts towards phasing down unabated coal power, for example. But it also calls to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, albeit without specifying a timeline for when this will happen. So definitely not perfect, and definitely a reflection of the different perspectives and narratives that countries come with to the negotiating table. But nevertheless, I think it's clearly a further step to signaling to the market that times are changing. And then, of course, we had very, very significant public and private funding pledges. And we also had the new framework on international financial reporting standards. And so we can see that these 3 elements, the targets, the final decision, COP decision, and the significant funding and finance commitments, those together are very important for the market. But in the end, it will depend, and also the ambassador said at the very beginning, it will depend on the action. And it will depend, in some cases, we really need to get to regulation. We can't only let the market listen to these ambitions, but there needs to be government intervention. And when we want to, we already heard on circularity, on recycling. There are very good options in the making to greatly increase the recycling of these green minerals. But it probably won't be enough to just let the market rule, because it is expensive, it requires new technology, so we will need public finance into the innovation space, and we will need regulation to channel some of the investment. So I think that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie, for addressing both questions, the gender question and the investment question. And indeed, you flagged to us like the importance of certainty and predictability of the regulatory frameworks for the investors, and that clearly investors and the private sector, they do need clear and predictable signals. And you've also sort of like shared some thoughts about what Glasgow did deliver in this regard. Now, with this, let us turn a little bit to the chat again. I see that there is a second question, and a question surrounding Africa again. It's about the geological situation in Africa. And now I could imagine that our next speaker is maybe well placed to address this. So, Paul, as I'm coming back to you, maybe you can share with us a little bit of information on the African dimension in response to the question in the chat. And Paul, Natalie has also just talked about the importance of recycling of critical materials. I understand that you did look into recycling and sort of also the efficiency part of the formula for sustainable critical mineral supply chains. So if you can address this would also be a wonderful link to the circularity agenda. Now let me play this back to Paul. So we have Ro on the screen. We maybe don't yet have Paul. Let's try once again with the tech team. If not, maybe we give the team a little bit more time to bring Paul back into the discussion. And there is so many sort of like important questions lined up. So let me zoom back into our next speaker. And Ho Lim, you have already mentioned to us some of the important developments that are going on in the WTO, particularly right now as you are sort of like preparing for MC12. Can you maybe mention a few more things in terms of what really is happening in terms of COP26 follow-up and ESG-related issues in the supply chain? So let us see whether we can bring Ho Lim back and then turn to Paul afterwards.
Hi, Elizabeth. I mean, I think we're still at the starting stages, to be honest. I mean, what we're seeing is that these statements will launch work programs for 2022, and then they hope to have a status report during the course of 2022. So the actions will still need to be further defined by the members within the three different initiatives. But one of the initiatives, which is the one on trade and environmental sustainability, has as an action point that they wish to work on sustainable supply chains. And they wish to look at how can they have both trade facilitative measures and at the same time that they have an ambition to try to make these supply chains as sustainable as possible. So I think that area still needs to be defined. It still needs to get more concrete. And the way in which these things get concretized at WTO are through members' proposals. So the hope is that the members who have signed up to these statements will be coming back in essence to this structured discussions at which they will be providing the other members who have signed on more clarity on how they wish to take these issues forward. The other thing I just to mention is that just as we work at the multilateral level, I think we shouldn't forget that a lot of the implementation and the work that needs to be undertaken will be at the national level. So I think what these structured discussions do and what these initiatives do is essentially help to build coherence at the national level. And to try to break down some of the silos between trade and environment. And I think there's quite a lot that can be done at the national level. And that would be very much in the spirit as well as COP26, which charts climate action through nationally determined contributions. So I think we would need to start thinking, I'd say we, but governments would need to start thinking about how do they use trade in the context of their own nationally determined contributions. And in that sense, also come back to this question of sustainable supply chains and the sustainability standards that would need to accompany them. So I think that's, well, my reflections at the moment. Thanks.
Many thanks, Ho, for bringing us back to the trade agenda here. And what you've mentioned in terms of the importance of sustainable supply chains is definitely of great interest for UNECE and our work on transparency of supply chains. And it's very encouraging to see that this concept is also mentioned in the draft ministerial declaration on the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. And it's also interesting to see that several WTO members who are also member states of UNECE, including countries with economies in transition, are part of this process. So now for the tech team, let us see whether we can bring back Paul for a moment. And if that is not possible, we turn to Karen, but let's try again.
Shall I address this question on Africa?
Paul, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the question on African resource potential for critical raw materials. This is an area that BGS has done a lot of work in over the last 3 years. We've had dedicated research programs on the critical raw material potential of Eastern Africa with a specific focus on lithium and graphite resources. But Africa as a whole is extremely well endowed in mineral deposits, but also deposits of many critical raw materials owing to its very diverse geology and complex geological evolution. We only have to think about the dominance of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, in terms of cobalt production and the role that it plays in global supply. But many African countries also have significant resources of lithium, graphite, rare earths, and niobium and tantalum, for example, to name just a few critical raw materials. Clearly, mineral development has the potential to bring significant opportunity and wealth generation to these developing countries. But I think what we have to consider looking further down the line is how we maybe support Africa and other developing countries to add more value domestically to their mineral resources. We typically see a situation with existing mineral production in Africa where the country may produce mineral concentrates, but these are then exported, and much of the added value is added outside the outside the continent. So they then have to potentially re-import products like lithium-ion batteries back into the economy. So we need to consider really where these developing countries, and this is the case for many African countries, potentially sit in the wider supply chain, and whether with interventions we can facilitate their increased movement along the value chain to bring greater wealth into the country, for example, through the production of lithium chemicals, as opposed to just exporting lithium concentrates overseas to countries like China, India, and Europe for reprocessing. I think we also have to face up to the fact that there is quite limited data and understanding on some of the specific socioeconomic and environmental impacts that surround development of critical raw material deposits in Africa. And for the development of critical raw materials to really benefit developing countries worldwide, but including in Africa, we need to clearly have very good governance, consider human rights, and minimize the environmental impacts associated with those development activities.
Thank you, Paul, for these remarks, and also for sort of like bringing our attention now in the context of the question about Africa, bringing our attention to the importance of increasing value added. So if developing countries or countries exporting these important critical raw materials, exporting them in raw form is one thing, but it's really important to move up the value chain and to increase the value added so that we can reap these development benefits that can potentially arise from this important sector. And so thank you, Paul, for drawing our attention to this and sharing some additional thoughts around this. Now, having looked a little bit at the development dimension, let me also turn this back to Karen. And Karen, you have already talked about the importance of standards and the role of standard setting bodies. And maybe you can share a little bit more about what these standard setting bodies can actually do to help countries. And that includes developed countries, developing countries, countries with economies in transition. What can these standard setting bodies do to help support the countries to deliver on some of the environmental challenges? And if you can share some thoughts on this. And also, Karen, if there is sort of like the one thing you would like to mention to us in terms of ensuring a sustainable and resilient supply chain, please also give us that one pointer you would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I guess what I wanted to mention was that there was actually a side event on just this topic as part of COP26 earlier this month. And what was emphasised at that event was that, and across many events, was that achieving the environmental goals and the targets as part of those commitments, it's going to require more than just those commitments. And the goals need to be aligned with the economy and all those that are actually participating in it, so that all parts of society can engage and take action. And international standards, I mentioned before about the consensus processes and who's involved, the way they are drafted, negotiated and agreed are a means to do that, to pull in all parts of society and to take action. Some examples in the area of the environment are in terms of standards that ISO have on reporting, accreditation, governance, and sustainable finance. The sustainable finance standards are newer standards, and with the rise of green bonds and investments on projects, inconsistencies in market practices and definitions, and what we hear about all the time, greenwashing, has increased. So new and upcoming ISO standards that are being developed in collaboration with experts from around the world, industry, government, and so on, they're helping to create a common language in this space and best practices. This in turn will help ensure that green and sustainable finance practices are effective and credible, but also hopefully attract higher investment in projects that support world climate change goals. So what I want to emphasize again is that it's not just about making sweeping statements, it's about getting everyone involved and informed. So it's important to get skilled professionals driving the impact of those standards. You mentioned as well, Elizabeth, I think there was a second part to your question about what I would see as the sort of the key, the most important thing in the supply chain. I think you said looking towards a net zero economy, taking into account critical minerals. And I think the one thing I wanted to emphasise was that the traceability of critical minerals, and Natalie mentioned it earlier on, that the traceability of critical minerals it's vital in helping the mining industry access investments and also improve its reputation. So, and here I wanted, and I know blockchain's come up a couple of times from the panelists, but I also want to emphasise it here because it does provide a more improved supply chains and fosters that more cost-efficient delivery of products and improves that coordination between partners in the supply chain. You may be aware ISO is developing standards on blockchain technologies and ledger technologies. And earlier this year, the Australian government, in fact, announced a partnership producing critical minerals blockchain technologies there. The technology is going to create a digital certification for critical minerals throughout the supply chain, from extraction to processing and then export to global markets. And the pilot is going to help companies in the sector adhere to regulations that they're required to, and also increase the demand for Australian minerals in the global markets. We're in discussions at the moment with the pilot project to incorporate the learnings from this use case into a set of use cases that ISO's preparing on the use of blockchain technologies that we hope to that will assist efforts in this space. Elizabeth, I hope that answers your question, and pleased to take any more.
Many thanks, Karen. And basically, you have already anticipated also further questions we got on the chat meanwhile. And it's been really interesting how you describe also a little bit the role of ISO and how it works with stakeholders. And I think that responds to one of the questions we got in the chat. And you've also nicely outlined sort of the cooperation we are having between different agencies, including UNECE and ISO. And I think that also responds to one of the questions we got in the chat. And obviously, the role of blockchain and technology is one we are all focusing on and curious to see more. Now, I think we have maybe another 10 minutes or so for further questions. And after that, we will turn to our Deputy Executive Secretary, Mr. Dimitri Mariasin, who is with us and will say some concluding remarks. And then we will also turn to our high-level speakers from the beginning for any concluding reflections to close up our discussion here today. And surely there is like a lot of rich information in all of this. Now, maybe for a last quick round of our panelists, and I see we have a question from the floor. Let me do that instead of what I was planning, and it's a great pleasure to give the floor to the delegation of Bulgaria, who has joined us in the room here.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. My question is a cross-cutting issue that touches upon many of the issues discussed by the different panelists. And I want to come back to one of the issues in the circular economy, and namely the issue of recycling. Ms. Natalie Bernasconi touched upon it briefly, but I would like to get some more insight on how this could help actually meet the needs of the future, namely extracting already used materials for in electronics, for example. Is this feasible? Is this cost efficient? How can this be regulated? And are there existing standards already in the field? Thank you very much.
Many thanks to the delegation of Bulgaria, and special thanks for bringing us back also on this circularity topic, which indeed is sort of crucial importance for our discussions in UNECE right now. You posed questions specifically to Natalie, so maybe we start with Natalie and see whether something about circularity in this context you can add, and that I'm also looking to the speakers if anybody else would wish to zoom into that particular question. Natalie.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I think that probably Paul will be more expert in terms of answering the question. But what I have read is from expert reports is that much more can be done. So we're really lagging behind on recycling technology and innovation. And you know, it's harder than some other materials to extract because of the quantities sometimes that are very small. So I think it is quite complex, but in terms of the research that has been done and published, it is absolutely, there is a lot of opportunity in the recycling, and it has been kind of underexplored and underused. So I think from my side or ISD side, I think one message is really that governments do need to provide some impetus into this area so that more is done in terms of innovation, investment, and just understanding how much we can do. But I'm sure that Paul will know very much, because I think this is a great initiative of the UK. And since he's leading these efforts, I look forward to hearing from him as well. So thank you for the question.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for raising this important role of innovation. And again, that fits very well with the work we are doing at UNECE, where we also have a team of specialists on innovation and competitiveness policies, where we are working with countries to see what are the type of policies that can be put in place to foster and support innovation. So clearly a very important dimension here. Now, we've already heard that it will be great to listen to Paul. I think there is also Ro on the screen. And so let me turn to the tech team and see whether we can bring Paul and Ro back so that they can answer this question. And maybe let's go by Ro first in the order of how we were all on the agenda, and then turn to Paul.
Elizabeth, thank you. Just to offer a perspective on the great question from the delegation of Bulgaria, I would say that for some metals, we are better at recycling than for others. Steel would be a good example, as would be copper, where we have high rates of recycling. But for other metals, there's a very long way to go. Lithium, for example, we currently recycle less than 1% of lithium that is in circulation in the market today. And there are many reasons for that, economics primarily being the most important, but equally supply chain and logistics are other reasons why. So evidently, there's a very, very long way to go on something like lithium. And here we have some experience from the recycling of old electronic devices, of course, as we have seen the problem of e-waste grow over time. But it's about to get even more intense as some of the early stage batteries used in electric vehicles reach the end of their life. For example, a EV battery contains around 10,000 times the amount of these critical minerals as, say, a smartphone might. And that gives you a sense of just how important getting our heads around this before we see a whole generation of EV batteries be ready at the end of their useful life. Final point I would say is, it's absolutely essential to maximize the full potential of the circular economy and recycling so that we only mine what we absolutely require. But in some cases, like copper, if we were to recycle every bit of copper currently in circulation between now and 2030, we would still only meet 60% of the demand for copper between now and 2030. And that's assuming 100% recycling. And it gives you a sense of the scale at which the demand for these critical minerals is set to grow. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Many thanks, Ro, for flagging sort of the importance of taking a differentiated approach across the different minerals and also putting us in perspective in terms of the scales of what is needed for really achieving our climate ambitions and at the same time sort of like transitioning to circularity. Now, let me turn to Paul. And then maybe for a quick closing, whether Karen and Ike would wish to add something, and then we will turn to our closing speakers. So now back to Paul, please.
Yeah, so just really to pick up on this issue with regards to some of the challenges with accessing stocks of secondary raw materials, even if we can accurately quantify what exists in the Anthropocene. In terms of the real challenges, I see it is, critical raw materials are used in very small quantities. They're vital to the performance of a device, but they're extremely well spread through society. So there's high dispersal rate in the products. And we also have quite poor understanding of where those metals reside in specific products, but also, importantly, the combinations that they've been grouped in terms of functional performance, but not necessarily thermodynamically compatible groups, which mean that accessing those metals and separating them out in the future could be quite challenging. And this is certainly an area where we need more innovation and technology interventions could help. I think also sometimes, although critical raw materials are extremely important and they're essential for decarbonisation of the economy, they can be a slight distraction from the bigger picture in terms of where the big efficiency gains could be made in terms of reducing carbon emissions associated with the extractive sector. If we were to put greater emphasis on the reuse and recycling of the major industrial metals such as iron, steel and aluminium and copper, because we use these metals in such large quantities, even relatively small efficiency gains have the potential to really significantly reduce the environmental impacts and footprints, particularly greenhouse gas emissions associated with their primary extraction and processing, irrespective of the scale of growth in critical raw material demand over the next few decades. The proportion of total materials flowing through society that are actually deemed critical or minor metals will still be relatively small relative to the proportion of the major industrial metals that we will continue to use and need.
Many thanks, Paul, for these remarks. Now, we are actually quite perfectly on time. Before we move to the closing remarks, let us just quickly see whether there is something Karen or Ho would wish to add. I don't see their hands raised or their cameras switched on. So maybe with that, we will then go to the final part of our discussion here today. And it's been a really rich discussion with so many different aspects being mentioned and thoughts being shared and also reflections about the challenges and the future. And to help us pull all of this a little bit together and help us also chart the way forward for UNECE, it's my great pleasure that we have had with us our Deputy Executive Secretary, Mr. Dimitri Mariassin. And I think now it's the time to give the floor to him for his reflections about what we've heard. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And Ambassador Manley, Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished guests. Of course, I have a very easy task to summarize what has been a wonderful 1.5 hours of highly expert discussion on the topic. And I'll try my best to maybe aggregate it in a few key messages. First of all, let's start from the big picture, where Ambassador Manley and the Executive Secretary of ECE have talked about why we're here. We're here because we need, as a key condition to implement the ambitions of Glasgow and the Paris agreements, resilient, sustainable, and ethical supply of critical raw materials. This is our starting point. Now, there are many nuances in how we get there. And I'd like to maybe single out 3 of them. One is the role of government and regulatory leadership that is required on this path. It's a very multifaceted topic, but it is very clear that, one, we cannot lose sight that how minerals are extracted, how they're produced. And this is as important as how they're used. Secondly, we need to simultaneously understand supply chain bottlenecks, reflect on trade policies, and how they can complement standards rather than contradicting them. So these are the two sides of the dilemma that governments face. More trade, but more responsible extraction at the same time, and also keeping the communities in mind, as well as such very important considerations as the role of women and gender considerations more broadly. So we heard about these elements where governments and non-governmental actors alike need to take a lead and send a signal. The word signal was used many times. Send a signal to the markets on the new pathway that governments are likely to take, and send then more firmly regulatory signals, including at the multilateral platform, such as ECE, but other platforms too. And the direction in which this is moving, and this is my second point, is ESG was mentioned as a key theme by almost all speakers. Environmental, social, governance standards as an enabler of both more competitive extraction and production of minerals, but also as a very, very important constraint on the currently irresponsible practices in many parts of the world. That's one. And secondly, circularity as an end ambition for many economies to reaching much higher rates of recycling and more deeply circularity. So starting not just looking at recycling, but already at the design of the future generation of products that contain critical minerals with the view of recycling them later. This is, I think, where we are becoming much more aware of the potential, not just the potential to reduce the pressure on the environment, but the potential for new sectors of the economy, for new sub-industries, new niches for many countries that are currently still looking at critical minerals as an extractive industry when it comes to extracting it from nature. One of the frontiers, and I think this was a round of comments from our speakers, is to look at extraction from currently existing and growing stock of products. And the striking figure that only less than 1% of lithium is currently being extracted should probably rest with us as a reminder what kind of path we have ahead of us. The third key area, which I think we all heard about today, is data, transparency, and then traceability linked to it. And of course, they are very much connected to the toolkit that the governments have at their hands, and also to ensuring the environmental, social, and governance standards. It all starts with having reliable data, with being able to trace, and with modeling. I really liked how one of the speakers put it, modeling that accounts for both the economic and environmental side. We need to have much more at our disposal from the point of view of digital tools that will enable us to trace better. And the emerging work, including things mentioned by ISO on critical minerals digital certificates, or some similar work starting now at ECE on creating certificates of origin for hydrogen, for example, a related topic, are both promising. I think we need much more coherence, much more discussion on digital tools that are at our disposal and the future digital frontier in this sense. So these are, in my view, some of the key takeaways. My most favorite metaphor used by Lord Sedwill was semiconductors, digital data, and critical raw materials are the new, I think if I heard correctly, oil, steel, and gas of the modern economy. This is really striking, and it really makes us rethink what we know of the global economy. 90% of, as Ambassador Manley mentioned, 90% of this new global economy is now, hopefully after Glasgow, on the path to net zero. Critical raw materials will play a very essential part on this path. As demand rises, trade will be so important, value chains will be so important. Looking at circular economy, both from the standards point of view and also in each country's policy toolkit, will become so important. And together, I think we can make it work. At the end, I'd like to thank on behalf of ECE, the United Kingdom for co-hosting this event, and we look forward to continued collaboration. Also, we really thank the partners who joined us, the International Council on Mining and Metal, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the British Geological Survey, of course, the World Trade Organization, Standards Australia, and ISO, a strategic advisory group on critical minerals. And I would be remiss not to mention the fantastic cross-teamwork of the Sustainable Energy Division and the Economic Cooperation Trade Division within ECE, led by their directors and dedicated staff members who've made this event possible in great collaboration with the mission of the UK here in Geneva. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dimitri, for putting it all together so well. And indeed, it's been a wonderful cooperation. And I understand that as part of the cooperation between UNECE and the UK, we will also go forward and develop a white paper together. And I think that's another very timely issue that is on our agenda. Now, it's been a real honor that our two very distinguished opening speakers have stayed with us despite their very busy agendas for 2 full hours, and really sat through all our discussions and listened attentively. And I would really like now at this point to give the floor back to our opening speakers and maybe Your Excellency Ambassador and then our Executive Secretary, so that they can sort of like close the session here today.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. First of all, I think I may be asking Dimitri if I can employ him, actually, in my mission, because I was absolutely brilliant summary and synthesis of 2 hours discussion. It's quite a talent. And it's always a privilege, but also with a certain sort of degree of trepidation to speak at an event when you're speaking just before your former boss, in that case, Lord Sedwell. So fortunately, it was only on pre-record, because otherwise he would have been towering over not just kind of metaphorically, but kind of quite literally keeping an eye on me here. So thank you. And I mean, it's been a real pleasure to be here, because it's been a real learning experience, and I've tried at best to listen attentively to all the really interesting speakers we've had, and I've taken a lot away from it about the scale of the challenge we face, and Dimitri kind of referred to it at the end. But I mean, the statistics that both Ro and Paul cited, I think, are just extraordinarily striking for us all when we think about what we need to do over the next few years. But as Natalie said, we start actually from a very a promising base, because back in Glasgow, we came together and we took decisions that were genuinely groundbreaking, particularly in terms of fossil fuels, but also deforestation and other issues. So we know that we can find this energy and ambition within the international community to meet and rise to these challenges, and we just have to do the same thing here. I would only say to my dear friend Ho, having spent the last few days in the WTO General Council and meetings of ambassadors fighting to keep rather modest references to Glasgow and COP26, I think we have a little way to go with some of our member states on this agenda. So all power to him and all those who are fighting the good fight to ensure that we pursue the implementation of the Glasgow Climate Pact with the energy and spirit of collaboration that we've seen in this room, both real and virtual, this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth.
So, well, I was not supposed to speak now, but really staying here for 2 hours and not reflect on what was said is impossible for me. So I will not keep you, I promise, very long, but maybe 2-3 thoughts. First of all, of course, I need to thank everybody who participated today, to all distinguished speakers and participating in your panelists and those who were engaged in this discussion. And please don't forget that we really don't finish by this discussion. As I mentioned, we will continue in April. One thought is that this important threat, Paris, Agenda 2030, COP26, as mentioned by Natalie, with although no big expectations, but there are some results, and the signal was given. And I wish in this discussion mention more Agenda 2030. Okay, all those concepts, traceability, transparency, circularity, innovation standards, everything is very important, what was addressed here. From that we see that it is not only cross-sectoral, like somebody mentioned here today, but it's really very complex, very comprehensive, and there is no one solution for that topic. We need to use all our tools that we have available. So, and this leads me to this circularity again, because it was mentioned several times here, and as Dmitry rightly mentioned, it's not about only exclusively about the waste circulation, but it starts indeed from design, but it goes through all the value chains. If we speak about production, distribution, trade, consumers, buyers, everybody should think about this circular concept, and it's really use less and use longer. Each of us, we can do it, but one example, I calculated this week by chance, in UNECE we have 63 tools, different standards, norms, guidelines, policy, publications, 63 tools on circular economy. And I want to mention just one out of those 63. And that is UN regulation that requires 85% of new vehicles mass to be reusable or recyclable, and at the same time 95% reusable and recoverable. And we know that today 1/4 of the globally produced vehicles are using that. So can you imagine that influence? So, and of course we have critical materials in such car, and so if we can achieve, just implement all of us just this one, the effect will be tremendous, but of course it's not enough, just this one. Okay, another thought is we spoke about women. I would like to speak about the youth. I was personally in Glasgow and I saw a big enthusiasm and engagement of the youth. So let us use that powerful energy. And my very last thought is not from my head, but I like it so much as we talk today about extractive. So it is, I will quote, "We can't mine our way out of the climate crisis." So I like it very much. So with these words, I really go back to Elizabeth. Thank you to all of you.
Many thanks, Olga and Ambassador, for these really inspiring remarks with which we will now close this session. And I think for me, it's just to also thank the tech team for guiding us through this event and to thank the audience for having been with us. And to the audience, maybe also a call for action. Stay tuned. Stay tuned about what else is happening. And we will be uploading the recording of this session and the details on our respective websites, and you can learn more about what's next by following the UK mission and UNECE on Twitter and social media. So with that, many thanks to everybody.